Lidford Mining, which is a Jamaican-owned company which exports between 80 and 100% of its output, depending on the year, but still have to pay full cost for their diesel fuel when their competitors, foreign-owned, do not have to pay the full cost. So, Minister, I would appreciate if you would advise us to these questions.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Honourable Minister, could the Minister state whether or not any provisions have been made to assist bauxite mining constituency from the bauxite levy during this financial year? We know, Mr. Minister, that there's a provision for bauxite mining constituencies to get a measly amount of $3 million. We would ask that that be revised because the amount of mining really small for the impact that we are seeing. So we ask that considerations be given, Minister. Minister is asking that I repeat. I am asking, Mr. Speaker, whether or not any provisions have been made during this fiscal year to assist the bauxite mining constituencies that are really under pressure, their infrastructure, their water supplies, and to say that we need to revise the 3-year payment from the Bauxite Institute that these constituencies get. We believe that the 3 years are too long in terms of getting $3 million for what is extracted from these constituencies.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the members for their contribution to the debate and for the questions that were asked. First, just want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that this bill, the origin of this bill, the Bauxite and Alumina Encouragement Act, dates back to 1950. That was the original of this bill, 1950. And has been revised in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth. And it was originally designed to encourage the production for export of bauxite and alumina in Jamaica. And I think members would agree it has served its purpose over time. With respect to some of the questions that have been raised, what happened during the period? During the period, a stay of execution was issued from the Financial Secretary through Customs, pending, so that she's able to issue a stay of execution pending this bill. If it didn't pass, then you have to go back and charge it. And she had a conversation with the Attorney General that supported that stay of execution. With respect to impost, just bear in mind that we are not introducing, or the intent is not to introduce a new concession. You'll recall in the 2013 arrangements with the fund, which we essentially repeated in 2016, we kind of froze the waivers and the concession environment. A new incentive act was introduced, and the idea during this period is not to introduce any new incentives. So the purpose of this bill is simply to extend what already exists. And in the original act, the language used in this amendment simply replicates what's in the Foundation Act. So in Clause 4, for example, uses the same language: no customs duty or other similar impost. And it uses the same language in Section 5, no customs duty or other similar impost. In practice, it's just a coverall that we don't have to come back here. Import means any, for example, additional stamp duty, something like that. Some other thing. It covers GCT, SET. If there is some levy that a now it's hard to introduce levies at the port of the WTO, but before WTO, governments could introduce charges, trade border charges without any restraint. And the idea was to cover all of those. The idea is they pay the world price for these fuels in the production. Now, the way in which the original act reads as well, and I think this covers one of the questions that Member Bunting had, but it's related to a question that you had as well. It specifically is focused on, here's what it says, and maybe your question was on petroleum fuels first, right?
Yeah, what about LNG?
Okay, so again, the idea here is just to keep the concept, we're not expanding the concessions. We're not, no, okay, now I see why I was twinning the two. I was correct. So the reason why the Act speaks specifically to items imported, as described, by a recognized alumina producer being relieved of these duties if the Commissioner of Customs is satisfied that they are imported by the holder of a contract with, sorry, that's not the one, the one before. It speaks specifically to the manufacture and transportation and shipping of alumina from bauxite, right? So the manufacture, the transportation, and the shipping. The original act says except petrol, which is different. I mean, petrol is a specific commodity, that's gas for motor vehicles. My interpretation, even though I wouldn't rely on that interpretation for, my interpretation is that the fuels that you mentioned would be covered by petroleum fuels. It just says excluding petrol. But the idea with this amendment is not to expand the range. It's just to extend the existing benefit. Right? With respect to, so those were that is my interpretation, yes. That it would be, based on this, how it's written, yeah. Except petrol. And it says in the manufacture chances, as long as you deem that the LNG is being used in the manufacture of, which I think clearly it is. With respect to the questions from the member from East Kingston, right? Not member Paula, the member from East Kingston and Port Royal. The question on the question 11. Remember, the answer to that question hasn't changed from the last time you asked it. So I don't want to repeat it, because I know if I repeat it, then you're going to stand up and you're going to tell me the same thing you told me the last time. So let's spare the rest of us that. It hasn't changed from the last time you asked me. Huh? Oh, you can't reply. Oh, that's good. Yes, we're a room full of visitors. On the question of the reserves, I mean, as the minister, I'm sure, will speak to that in his presentation. And the question on focusing on value added, I believe the policy of the government is to do exactly that, and therefore the things that you are aware of, because you had a hand in, the idea is to expand the value-added component of the sector while retaining this that has been here for 40 or 50 years. With respect to the question from the member from Central Manchester on what measures are in place to ensure no leakage of benefit, member, this act has been in place since 1950, and the measures in place today have been in place since that time. And I would just I draw your attention to the section of the Act that is relevant to the question, Section 5, subsection 3 of the original Act. It says, for the purpose of this section, any article specified in Part 2 of the schedule, i.e. the articles to be imported, shall be deemed to be imported by a recognized alumina producer if the Commissioner of Customs is satisfied that they are imported by the holder of a contract with such producer to perform construction work for such producer, and that the articles so imported will be solely used for the purposes of performing such work or any work in connection with the repair, maintenance, or restoration. It has the same for, and upon conclusion of such work, either be disposed by the contractor to such producer or be re-exported by the contractor. And if the contractor gives security to the satisfaction of the Commissioner of Customs. So I would say to you, member.
Minister,
Yes.
if you just yield, what you're saying there refers to an industry that was structured very differently. They were vertically integrated operations. They did their own mining, their own loading, their own haulage. That speaks specifically to contractors that they used, but it did not anticipate the I should say construction contractors who would build expansions of the plant, etc. But it never contemplated the type of haulage contractors, mining contractors, suppliers of inputs. So the industry now, the structure of the industry has moved from that vertically integrated to a much looser consortium of players who collectively conduct what one vertically integrated player like an Alcan or an Alcoa used to. 50s arrangement, as you have described there, really doesn't apply to the industry.
That member, I was reading the section to suggest to you that the Commissioner of Customs is empowered if it comes to her attention that some of this fuel on which concessions have been applied is not being used for supply to the industry to step in and to charge the requisite duties. So I would say to you, to persons in your constituency or people who you represent from your constituency and so forth, who feel in some way negatively impacted by this, if it is brought to the attention of a Commissioner of Customs, and if it indeed is the case, it can be addressed. Because the intention is to be only, this benefit is only to be used by the producer itself or by persons contracted by the producer in the provision of that service, other things. And the Commissioner is empowered to audit. Huh? No, you're making the point that people who compete with them are adversely affected. So if the person's adversely affected...
It's two completely separate points. The first has to do with, when I say, the leakage, that is, fuel that was imported under the concessions finds its way into the regular market. And that could be at many different points. At the port, at the plant, at the mines, through going likely that those people who are benefiting will be the ones, because they will benefit from sharing that margin, that saving. It's unlikely they're going to bring it to my attention or anybody else's attention, because they will be the ones benefiting, but the taxpayer generally and the revenues will be the ones suffering. So that was the first instance. The other instance is now where the competition issue, which is a discrete and separate issue, where those who are competing, and it has been raised many times. Shagor in aggregates in Maypen have raised repeatedly publicly the fact that they are at a big disadvantage because they're a mining and aggregate operation. They don't have the concessions, but they're competing against people who do have the concession. So it's not that it hasn't been done. So what I'm asking you is if you can, through your team, say if there is a special monitoring mechanism, an ongoing mechanism, an audit team or an enforcement team to ensure that, because anecdotally there's a lot of leakage, and from a competition point of view, that is the unfair competition point of view, that point has been made repeatedly in public by other players.
Thank you, member. So these concessions that apply to this industry, unfortunately, are not unique to this industry. As a matter of policy, the government offers concessions in other areas. Think of sugar, raw white sugar used in manufacturing, and in that area we do have, from time to time, allegations. Let's call them allegations for the time being. There's also the concessions extended to charities, right? And you do have allegations of diversion and leakage. So this is a general problem or challenge with concessions generally of this nature, and not something necessarily specific here, which is why it'd be better to have a situation where we don't need them in the first place because the environment is so efficient or our duty structures are so low, but we're not there yet. By introducing it as a broader problem than simply a bauxite problem, what I'd say to you is that customs has departments that are mandated to enforcement, and it's enforcement of measures such as this, concessions for a particular industry, whether it be white sugar for the manufacturing, or it be charity concessions, or it be fuel for bauxite, to monitor and to enforce the customs regulations. And that is what they do. I can't suggest that it means that there is no leakage in any particular area, but they are empowered to uphold the regulations as they exist. Since you mentioned the matter, I will ask the Commissioner of Customs to look into this one in particular, but I don't want the members or the public at large to think that's a problem that's unique to, if it indeed is a problem, that it would be unique to bauxite and alumina. It is whenever you have a structure that amount, and we have that structure across the breadth of industry, what people import. If you're a manufacturer, you can get certain things tax-free. If you're not a manufacturer, you pay the duty. The theoretical possibility of leakage exists, right? And what we have to do is to have a customs that's empowered to investigate and to enforce. Sure, you asked me to yield.
My question?
No, it's just one. The issue, as I understand it, that was being posed by the member from Central Manchester, involves the point about the possibility of leakage, but it was also raising the question of the parity of treatment across different subsectors of mining. The effect, the likely effect, and it can be resolved in this bill, but the likely effect of tilting the playing field in favor of bauxite is that you are simultaneously providing a disincentive for innovation to take place in other subsectors of the industry, limestone mining. There may be other areas of mining as well. And it was an issue which arose when we looked at the omnibus incentives legislation. Because what you have is that investments inevitably flow disproportionately in the sector which is privileged by investments. And by virtue of that fact, we are also disincentivizing investment in the other sectors. In the near term, it facilitates growth in a particular sector. But over time, what you have happening that it constitutes a drag on the economy as a whole. So I guess the question I would ask is whether, as we continue the process of reform, we're looking at these incentives
having these concessions almost warehoused in one subsector of mining, bearing in mind that mining, as you point out, is bauxite, but it's also gypsum and limestone and other, gold and other things, is a good point, and one I'm sure that you would have had to confront that is the greatest danger for us to accept. I mean, believe me on that. So you know that Jamaica went the way of specific sector incentives for a long period of time, so 4 decades, and we had 4 decades of average 0.9% growth. And we recognized as a then government, as a society, that we had to move in a different direction with an omnibus system of incentives, even though some, like the grandfather. Just as a response to you, member, I think it is important that the principle of omnibus is maintained. If we reverse, and I want to use that language, reverse to a situation where we have yes, to, a specific sets of incentives, one for each. Yeah, we have to find a way to move forward. Exactly. We don't need these specific incentives, that we are so efficient in other ways, or that the overall rates are so low that we don't need that. I know you would. But thank you nonetheless for the question and the comment that was included. So, Mr. Speaker, I closed the debate on the bill, and I ask that it be read a second time. Oh, but before I do that, Mr. Speaker, just introducing an amendment that was tabled, and I had discussions with Member Golding.
Mr. Speaker. Oh. Mr. Speaker, I have not heard a response to my question.
Yes. Member, I apologize. On that. Your question, and as I was writing as you spoke, you were asking about the 14 constituencies and the bauxite communities and water. You'll recall, Mr. Speaker, that I stood in just a few weeks ago in the budget, and I mentioned that the government had increased the allocation to rural water 8-fold, from just over, no, he spoke about water first, from $100 million in the previous financial year to $795 million in this financial year. And that's just for rural water. And I would submit to you, member, that the bauxite constituencies will benefit. And from the list that I saw of where rural water this allocation is going to go to, several bauxite communities are included in that. With respect to the $3 million a year per constituency, I would need to consult with the Minister of Mining, to whom that question is better directed. But the principle of supporting the communities from which this non-renewable commodity is derived is one that we have no divide on. So, Mr. Speaker, I was saying the amendment, a very small amendment, is included in the amendment sheet, and during the clause by clause, we'll introduce it. But I asked Mr. Speaker and I thank Member Golding for the suggestion there to ensure that the future extensions of this concession would be done by way of affirmative resolution in the House, having been tabled by the Minister. I ask that it be read a second time.
The question is that the bill be read a second time. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? As of it, clerk. Bill be read.